Welcome to episode 305 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Steve Bennett, who served in the FBI for 23 years. In this episode, he reviews a case involving a 15-year-old missing teen who disappeared from her home but returned after a few weeks. When a relative recovered a piece of paper in the girl's purse with the name and address of a man living in Minneapolis, Minnesota, police suspected that the stranger had something to do with the girl's initial disappearance. After local detectives determined the interstate aspects of the case were beyond the scope of their small department, the case was referred to the Springfield FBI office and assigned to Steve Bennett, who, with assistance from the Springfield Division's victim specialist and a member of CART, was able to identify, arrest, and convict the subject for interstate transportation of a minor for the purpose of sex under the Mann Act. Springfield, Illinois was Steve's first office, where he served for 10 years as a Safe Street Task Force coordinator on cases involving the most dangerous violent offenders. During that time, Steve became a member of the SWAT team and was also a special agent assessor, part of a team interviewing new special agent candidates. After the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, Steve assisted the evidence response team and traveled to New York to help sift through debris from the World Trade Center attack. Upon returning to Springfield, Steve was reassigned to a counterintelligence squad. He was later promoted to supervisory special agent in the counterterrorism division at FBI headquarters and later became a unit chief of a 24-hour operation at the Terrorist Screening Center. He spent the last 2 years in the Office of Partner Engagement, Violence Reduction Unit, where he oversaw an amazing team responsible for the FBI's active shooter response program. Since retiring from the FBI, Steve started his own company, Lincoln 41 LLC, which conducts private investigations and provides law enforcement training and consulting. He has also worked for private companies supporting the Insider Threat Mission and is a member of the Bureau Consortium, mass shooting and workplace violence experts forged through unparalleled FBI experience. Now, before we get to the case review, I want to wish you a very happy new year. Summing up 2023 for me, I would say that I experienced some exciting times to include reaching my 300th episode. And of course, we can't forget my epic interview with current FBI Director Christopher Wray. I'm not sure if I'll ever top that mic drop moment. Also, in 2023, I unexpectedly lost someone special and was reminded that we need to live our best lives now. Don't hold back. I dedicate 2024 to Marianne. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find links to where you can join my reader team to keep up with the FBI and books, TV, and movies, buy me a cup of coffee, and learn more about me and my nonfiction book, FBI Myths and Misconceptions, and my 2 FBI crime novels, Pay to Play and Greedy Givers, all available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Plus, my FBI word search puzzle book, Fun for Armchair Detectives. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent Steve Bennett. Hey, Steve, how are you?
Hey, Jerry, I'm doing great. Thanks.
Well, I am really interested in you talking about this case because lately in the news, there's been lots of talk. I know the Bureau's even had a big press release out about sextortion, getting kids just to do things online for the sexual gratification of the person extorting them or bribing them. But your case shows that it's been going on for a long time. And so I really wanted to talk about this case to show people need to be aware of who their kids are talking to and meeting with. Where do you want to start?
Well, I guess I'll start with where I was in my career and the field office I was in. So it's kind of easy to understand the situation. I was assigned to Springfield, Illinois' field office, which is one of the smallest in the Bureau. And I know you were assigned to a big field office in Philadelphia. So there's probably quite a bit of difference between the types of work that you're exposed to, depending on what part of the country you're in and what types of cases you're assigned to work. So I'd been in the Bureau about 5 years in 2001 when this case came to light, and it happened right after the 9/11 attacks. So, as you remember, we were all very focused on covering all sorts of leads across the country, which related to the 9/11 attacks and what we thought might be more attacks coming down the line. So, I was actually a Safe Streets Task Force coordinator. So, I had a small group of people, state and locals, who were sworn in as federal agents who worked violent crimes, drug offenses, major offenders, weapons violators, and things like that. So I was very busy with search warrants and arrest warrants and trials and grand jury and all those things that are very interesting and that really teach you a lot about, how to work cases in the FBI. And even though I was assigned to that type of work, there was still regular cases that would come in. And in a small office, there's kind of a jack of all trades mentality. And so I would get a white collar case sometimes, or a bank robbery, or a public corruption case. So it was great for me to learn how to do different types of cases. So this case that happened, the actual crime occurred right before 9/11 in July of 2001. There was a 15-year-old girl in rural Illinois, Jacksonville, Illinois, which is a small to medium-sized city in Morgan County. And the Springfield division, Jerry, covered 84 of 102 counties in Illinois. So we had a lot of area, but the Chicago field office had a smaller area, but all of the population. So we were the downstate field office. And so this case was one of many cases that would come to us from state or local agencies that would sometimes need some help in investigating or furthering their investigations that might have a bigger nexus or relationship to other states. And this one did. So there was a girl, and we'll call her Jenny. She was 15 years old, but she was a very naive and sort of immature 15-year-old. And like a lot of people in 2001, they were experimenting with the internet and they were meeting people on the internet. They were chatting and having different interactions. And she happened across a person from Minnesota who she became friends with. She was a typical kid that, wasn't the happiest kid at school. And this person took interest in her, complimented her. And, we would now call it grooming. He paid a lot of attention to all the things, and he was very perceptive at picking up on what was important to her. So they became friends over a period of weeks. And as he realized that she wasn't incredibly happy at home or in school, he offered her some help. And so what happened is he ended up saying that he could come and pick her up and take her back to Minneapolis, Minnesota, where he was from, if she would just kind of keep quiet about it. So what Jenny did is she told her mother that she was going to spend the weekend with a friend. And if her mom would just drop her off at a local park called Community Park, a well-known little park that had an antique Ferris wheel in it. And just right under the Ferris wheel, there was a picnic area. And her mom had to go to work on the evening shift as a forklift driver in a manufacturing facility. And if she would just leave her there, her friend's mom would pick her up. And she'd spend the weekend and a couple days of the next week at her friend's house. And then she'd come back home in the middle of next week.
So who did she think that this man in Minneapolis was? Did she think he was somebody her age? And what was it that he told her that she would be able to do if she came to Minneapolis that she couldn't do at home?
She never really said exactly how old she thought he was, but he was 49, turning 50 at that time. And she clearly didn't understand the difference between her age and his age as far as looks and interests and things like that. So she thought he was much more attuned to her lifestyle and definitely younger in mentality, if not younger in age. And I don't think he ever divulged his age to her. And he was very good at just, having the same interests or appearing to have the same interests as she did. So what he told her was just he would expose her to a different part of the country and she could get away from things that she wasn't happy with and maybe she'd be happier. And that was kind of his shtick. And it seemed like a good idea to her. So she was dropped off in the middle of July in the evening. And sure enough, after waiting there with a sleeping bag and some clothes, a guy pulled up and his name was Gary Wykelius. And Gary picked her up in his car. And there was one witness to this who saw a car pull up and a young girl get in the car and noticed that the older gentleman reached over and kissed her on the cheek. And that was a little odd to a couple that was walking in the park, and they noted it. And it wasn't until the middle of next week when the mother realized that the daughter did not go to her friend's house because she called to check in and realized she wasn't there and had never been there. So that's when the missing person report got completed about 4 days later. And Morgan County Sheriff's Office started their investigation. They knew it wasn't a typical runaway, and they started trying to interview people and figure out where this girl might be. So what happened is Gary took Jenny back to Minneapolis, and he traveled in a car that he had rented, and he took her back to his home, and she stayed there for about 2 weeks. After 2 weeks, she wanted to go home, and he was able to get enough money together to get her a bus ticket to go back home. And everybody was very happy that she returned, that she wasn't visibly injured, she wasn't killed, she was back home. And it seemed like the family just wanted to forget about what happened, and she was in no mood to discuss where she'd been. And so the Morgan County Sheriff's Office was kind of stuck in their investigation. Her older sister looked in her purse and saw some notes that she had written, and that's where she saw Gary's name, and she turned that over to the sheriff's department. And once they interviewed Jenny wasn't very forthcoming, and she, provided some false information because she was both embarrassed and hurt about what had happened. They realized that there was a good possibility that this older gentleman had taken her back to Minneapolis and done things with her that he certainly had no right to do. And that's when it got turned over to the FBI about 3 months later, actually. And that's when I opened the case.
So when she returned, it seemed like they still wanted to pursue it, that they knew that it was more than a runaway, changing her mind and coming back home. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. They did a great job trying to get the facts about what occurred, but she was not forthcoming. And every time that their investigation pushed them towards somebody several states away, they were sort of stymied with how to further their investigation, especially when she was providing different information, different names, and things like that. Even when she had communicated with Gary over the internet, she would use a different name for herself. He would use a different name for himself, just in case anybody saw any of the chats or any of the emails that went back and forth. It would be harder to tell who was talking to whom. And so she was pretty smart about not wanting to tell the whole story, which just kind of didn't help with the investigation. And so when I got the case, it was tough because 3 months had passed, and I was told that the victim and the family just really wasn't all that interested in pursuing it. They just kind of wanted to go on with their lives. So it took me a while to figure out the best way to approach her. And again, what happened between when she was picked up by Gary and when I got the case was the attacks on 9/11, which kind of pushed us in lots of different directions. But it didn't mean that all the cases that we had going and all the other things that were going to come on our plate didn't need to be addressed. And this was an important one that did need to be looked into immediately.
It's wonderful to hear that this local police department wanted to pursue this, because a lot of times when you hear about missing kids, they talk about local police wanting to just label missing kids as just simply runaways and not wanting to do a full investigation. But that's not what occurred in this case. They really did want to find out what happened, and if there was any criminal involvement, they wanted to find that out and pursue it to the point of referring it to the FBI, who had that capability of doing investigations that occurred outside of their jurisdiction, outside of the state.
Jerry, you're exactly on point with that comment, and it really speaks to what the FBI is good at and really prioritizes. And that is having relationships with all these other law enforcement agencies so that they know when the FBI can get involved and how they can help with crime scene investigations and interviewing and mass shootings and all sorts of things that we can assist in, and that we have the power to bring in lots of resources to help. So it really has to do with forging relationships at task force meetings and conferences and getting a cup of coffee with the sheriff and local officers so that they will pick up a phone and they know to call Jerry or Steve, not just the FBI in general. So relationship building is a huge part of our job. So when I decided that it was best to try to talk to Jenny, I took two very important people with me. The first is a victim specialist. And I know on some of your shows you've talked about the victim services division, but every field office will have one or more victim specialists, which can really help with people who are victims and witnesses of crimes because they don't know what's expected of them. Are they going to have to testify? Are they in danger? What is needed of them? Where do they have to go? Things like that. And so a victim specialist is trained in how to talk to people and explain what might come down the line as they cooperate with the FBI. So the victim specialist I took was great, specially trained, and could deal with a young female maybe in a better way than I could as a middle-aged male. And I also took a CART examiner. So we have a computer analysis team in every field office. And so I was hoping that if Jenny and Jenny's mother would allow us to take the computer that she had communicated with Gary on, that we could maybe get some of the data that had the metadata that was retained, because Jenny was very smart also about deleting anything right after the conversation so that nobody would find it later. But as you know, there's often metadata, little bits and pieces of messages that are stored that our CART analysts can forensically recover. And so that's why I took a CART professional with me. That kind of speaks to the value of the professional support staff that we have in the Bureau. We have some trained specialists that are just great at helping with cases, and they can become the unsung heroes in the FBI at times, Jerry. It took a while to build rapport with the family, but once they realized that this could be bigger than just Jenny, that this person could have done this before and may do this again, they were more receptive to talking with us. And Jenny told me the whole story, and I asked her to explain every bit and piece of the story, even the things that she didn't think would have any bearing on the fact pattern. And what she told me was when Gary picked her up, she knew that the car that he drove was a rental car because of the key tag. It had a rental car agency's name on it. I asked her if on their way back to Minneapolis, when he stopped to get gas or if they stopped to get food, if he used a credit card or any other cash to pay for things, because we know that if a credit card was used, that would show the transaction, how much it was, where it occurred, the time, and things like that, which we knew would help show that, maybe corroborate her story that he came to Illinois from Minneapolis and then took her back. And then she said that in fact, he did use some sort of a credit or debit card because he got gas, but he didn't go into the facility. And he always kept a close eye on her. And then when they got back to Minneapolis, he started talking to her about things that were pretty hard for a 15-year-old to hear, like she was overweight and she maybe needed to lose some weight. And so he provided her with what he called was a vitamin, and it made Jenny sleepy. And so she went to sleep as soon as she got to his place. And when she woke up, of course, he was unbuttoning her clothes and doing things that she didn't want to happen. But she was groggy. She was 15. He had come all this way to pick her up, and she didn't know how to tell him no. And so some sexual things happened, and they happened over and over during this 2-week period that she stayed there. And she was concerned because she said, I didn't forcefully tell him no, but I didn't want it to happen. But of course, being at the age of 15, she was not of the age of consent. So that wasn't such an important factor. So the fact pattern we had really supported a crime called transportation of a minor with intent to engage in sex, which is part of what's called the Mann Act. So it's also used with human trafficking. And the 3 elements I would have to prove would be that Gary knew or should have known that Jenny was in fact a minor, so she was under the age of 18, that he transported her across state lines, that gives FBI jurisdiction and establishes the interstate nexus, and that travel was for purposes of sex. So the best way to prove that if they had sex is to show that the sex occurred. So Jenny told me a story from start to finish, which was believable and made sense. But now I had to corroborate it because it was just one person's story. And if you remember, she had told some false parts to the story to the police. So, of course, a defense attorney, if this ever were charged, would bring up, how do we know which parts are true? She said here one story, she said there another story. So I had to corroborate all the things that she said. She told me that when she stayed with Gary, he had a black Labrador dog that she got to know. She said he was getting windows installed in his house while she was there. And she said she went with him to get blinds for the windows from Target, and that she went with him to take the dog to the vet. So these were just little, stories that she told, but they turned out to be important to kind of corroborate her story. So as this was unfolding, there was a large amount of time that passed, Jerry. I opened the case in, I think, October of 2001, and I had other cases. And by the time I got the report done and got her to cooperate and collected the computer and it was analyzed, what happened was they found little bits and pieces of their conversations. And he used 3 different email addresses. One was, he called himself Big Country 4. Another name he used was Mellow Older Guy. And the most memorable email he used, which was kind of shocking, from 50-year-old guy from Minnesota, was he used the screen name or email address mnhardman69, mnhardman69 at yahoo.com.
Not subtle at all.
Not very subtle. So we found bits and pieces of some of these messages to corroborate that a person using her computer corresponded with a person in Minnesota. However, we couldn't confirm that those email addresses were in fact him, because as you know, if you're using public source Gmail and Yahoo, some people will use false names when they create those accounts, as opposed to using, a paid like AOL account back then where you would be billed. You could kind of relate that or correspond that with a real person. So it was hard to say that was Gary that was using those emails, but it did definitely correspond with the story that Jenny told. Another good tactic, and I'm sure you use this too, Jerry, to figure out the best way to investigate a case is to sit with your squad mates and just run the story by them, and their experiences would help you formulate how you're going to investigate it. And I was kind of embarrassed that I hadn't thought of this, but one of my colleagues said, well, have you collected the credit card information and searched all the databases like TransUnion and Equifax and all those credit source databases, which would show where he has tried to get credit cards, which in fact would show where maybe some of his credit cards are. And I hadn't done that early on, which I should have. So I immediately sent grand jury subpoenas to these credit bureaus. And of course, I was inundated with data a month or so later to show where he tried to get loans and where he had attempted credit cards. I sent further subpoenas to some of the banks that he had attempted to get credit cards, and I found one that was still active, and then had to send, more subpoenas to get the credit card activity for the dates in question. So, I was hoping that the credit cards would show the rental of the car that he used and to show some transactions, going from Minnesota to Illinois during the time frame in question. So it took, more months to get that data. But when we sifted through it and honed in on the July of 2001 time period, sure enough, we found credit card transactions for his credit card used in a nice pathway from Minnesota to Illinois and going back, purchasing gas and renting a car, and information that really corroborated her story about him traveling during that time frame. So that was very helpful to the case. What it came down to as time passed, and I discussed the prosecution of this with the assistant U.S. attorney, he said something that wasn't surprising. He said, "Steve, you have a great circumstantial case. You have a witness, a victim, but we really need a good interview and a confession from Gary." So time had passed. It had been almost a year now. And, that's going to be a tough sell to go find this guy in Minneapolis and interview him and get him to admit to transporting a minor across state lines for purposes of sex and that the sex occurred. So in the Bureau, how we handle things that need to be done in a different part of the country is we set leads to other field offices. That's kind of the beauty of the FBI being such a national organization. We don't get in our car or hop on a plane and travel across the country to further our case. We set a lead to another field office to have an agent take pictures of something, interview someone, collect information that might be in the court system in that state, and then send the results back to us. So we set leads for other divisions, they cover the leads, and they send the information back to us. So I actually approached the Springfield leadership team and I asked that we not set a lead to Minneapolis, that I be allowed to travel there myself and interview Gary, because I said, there's no way I'm going to be able to explain all the idiosyncrasies in this case, and I want to do it myself. And to their credit, Jerry, they allowed me to do that. That isn't the most economical way to proceed. We can't always travel across the country, but if we coordinate with the other field offices and they agree to it, sometimes we can actually travel ourselves and conduct the investigation in that other field office. And they allowed me to do that. And Minneapolis allowed me to do that. And so I arranged a trip to Minneapolis, and an agent met me when I flew in to the Minneapolis field office territory. And he went with me, and we had one day to find and interview Gary. And then my flight was already scheduled to return the next day. So fly in one day, find Gary and interview him the next, and then fly back to Illinois on the third day.
Now, did Gary have any idea that you were investigating him, or was this going to be one of those surprise visits?
It was exactly that. As far as I knew, he had no idea that he was under any type of investigation. One of the things I did early on and should have mentioned was when running his criminal history, I was able to find out that he had previous arrests for child sex related offenses, but no conviction. So he had been investigated by a local department for some sort of a crime years ago involving a child, which, sort of made sense and buttressed information that Jenny was telling me. So I had a lot of information that was important, but it really came down to verifying it. I knew that Jenny wouldn't particularly be a good witness, and to have her in court to testify to some of these things that happened and be subjected to cross-examination would be devastating to her. She was a very soft-spoken girl, and it would just be a tough sell for a jury to even understand her and hear her. She had provided false information in the beginning. So what we really needed was to make the case as strong as possible so that if we arrested and indicted Gary, that he wouldn't have much of a chance to do anything but plead guilty. And that's really the power of the federal system. I would say 90 to 95% of the people that we charge plead guilty because we're of the mindset of we overwhelm a person with the strength of our case. We don't leave anything to chance. When we go to arrest somebody, we have our case made. And I remember sitting with an assistant U.S. attorney one time on one of my drug cases and saying, I think we have enough to arrest him now. And he said, Steve, we had enough to arrest him a long time ago, but we don't arrest him when we have enough to arrest him. We arrest him when we have enough to convict him, because the case doesn't get any better after the arrest.
That needs to go on a T-shirt.
Yeah, that was a great learning point for me. That was exactly where we were with this case. I really needed to get some incriminating statements from Gary. So when I flew in, I was picked up by a really young, amazing, fun agent to work with. If you remember the 19 hijackers that were responsible for the attacks on 9/11, when all their names came to the forefront, there was a 20th hijacker, Zacharias Massawi, who had some relationship to Minneapolis. He had lived there. He had also taken flight training. And so Mr. Massawi was arrested by the Minneapolis field office only a short time before I got there. And the agent who helped me was part of that arrest. So to hear the story of the arrest of the 20th hijacker from one of the agents who was involved in it and who was helping me was another really fascinating part of this case and this story. So when we went to Gary's house, we found, as luck would have it, that he no longer lived there. He had recently moved. And we had one day to figure out where he moved to and track him down, or I was going to have to fly back and not have interviewed him. He lived in a rural part of Minneapolis, which is, I learned, full of a lot of lakes. Minnesota has a lot of what I would call Indian country and a lot of lakes. And so we traveled about an hour and a half, and we found where Gary lived in a mobile home in a very rural part of the state. And we had one chance really to find him and interview him. And if this didn't work, then we would be back to square one on the case. So we pulled up to the trailer, and there was a older model Ford Bronco parked in the driveway. So I thought maybe somebody was home. And we walked up and knocked at the door, and a gentleman answers the door. And right next to him was a black Labrador dog, just like Jenny had told me. So I thought this was probably Gary. So I introduced myself and showed him my credentials, said I was with the FBI. And I thought the best way to approach him would be to treat him with respect and ask for his help with a case that I was looking into, not to say anything incriminating about him. And so that's what I did. He stepped out onto the porch, and he very soon let me know that he did not care for police. And he kind of loudly and very close to me said, I hate police, and kind of pushed me backwards almost. And of course, I'd been a police officer for 10 years, but I was aware enough to say, well, sir, I'm not a police officer. I'm an FBI agent, to kind of distinguish the difference between police and FBI, which I work very hard on a daily basis to show the relationship and that we all work together. Well, in that circumstance, I really tried to separate it because he clearly had some bad interactions with police. So when I said, look, I'm with the FBI, I'm not with the police, he seemed to calm down. And after a couple minutes, he invited us in. And my intro to talking to Gary was, I think you met a person, a young girl from Illinois a while back, and you tried to help her. And I'm building a profile, and I think you can help me. And once I said that I was looking for his help, that he had met a girl that he was trying to actually offer help to, maybe, he was receptive. And so he basically said, look, I talked to a lot of people over the internet. I'm not sure who you're talking about. And so I started to describe her and the area of Illinois, and that I thought he had picked her up one night. She wasn't very happy in her situation. And that was a laudable thing, that he tried to help somebody. And he really played into that. And he said, okay, I think I might remember. Was the park that you're talking about, did it have an antique Ferris wheel in it? And that was the point that was so important, because where she was sitting was right under that well-known antique Ferris wheel in Community Park in Jacksonville. So I was able to say, yes, Gary, that's the girl I'm talking about. So I quickly said, now, to make sure we're talking about the same person, this girl would have been 15. Is that right? And the best I could get him to say regarding her age was, I knew she was young. So then I said, so you actually went to Illinois to help her? Is that right? And did you drive your Ford Bronco that's out there? And he said, no, I actually rented a car because I didn't think my Ford Bronco was reliable. So I rented a car and drove it to Illinois and brought her back. And by then, of course, I already had the credit card information showing that the car had been rented with his credit card. So that was just more corroboration to her story. And it was now in his words. And then the tough part was to get him to admit to the transporting her was for purposes of sex. So I said, Gary, in building this profile for this person, Jenny, can you help me with all the things about her? And he quickly thought that either she was missing again or possibly dead. And he asked me that. And my response was, well, Gary, you can understand that as my investigation unfolds, I'm not at liberty to discuss things with you yet. And he understood that. And he said, okay. But he was more than happy to help me build this profile of this girl. So I began asking questions about, her hair color, if she dyed her hair, if she had tattoos, if she wore earrings, things that were really irrelevant to any of the things that we were there to talk about. But what it did is it built rapport and it made these questions and answers go back and forth in a very calm and even-handed way. And he was happy and comfortable to answer all these questions. I asked about her interests, whether she was a religious person, whether she was computer savvy, all sorts of things. And I interspersed into the conversation to just get into sex a little bit. I said, Gary, we're older guys. I said, I got to ask you something. When you have sex, and I said, this is embarrassing. And at least, we're all men here, but do you wear a condom? And he was very, kind of amazed at such a question. And he said, well, I'm not sure why you'd ask that, but no, I don't wear a condom. And I said, we as men, we have to be super careful because sometimes you can get sexually transmitted diseases and they're dormant in men and we just don't know that we even have them. So I said, as you can appreciate, I can't get into things, but maybe you should just get checked out. There's these clinics. I don't know if you have a doctor, but, just to make sure you're healthy. And then I went on to more questions about whether or not she knew how to drive a car and whether or not she read books and what her interests were. And then I would come back to, sexually transmitted diseases that you can get them, not yet know you have them, but, you get some medication and you're all better and just, you should maybe get checked out. And that really piqued his curiosity about why I would even mention anything like that. And I think it kind of had the desired effect. And as we kept talking, I just slipped in the question and I was sure to phrase it in a very straightforward way. And I said, Gary, I'm trying to understand how she reacted to certain things. And I said, when you had sexual intercourse with Jenny, did she ever do anything kind of odd or noteworthy after the act? So, I broke it up into two parts. When you had sexual intercourse, and I wanted to make sure I used those words with Jenny, but then I really emphasized, did she do anything strange or noteworthy or odd afterwards? And he just stared at me. And there was maybe 15 or 20 seconds of silence. And I thought, of course, his answer could easily be, well, I never had sexual intercourse with her. But his answer was, Jerry, that, well, there was one time when afterwards she really started flailing her arms and was very upset, but most of the time she just cried. And when he said that, that really admitted to the act that I needed him to address.
But it says so much more.
He really was kind of disarmed when he admitted that. And as soon as he said it, we all stopped again. And I think he realized almost immediately that he said too much. And I remember the other agent kind of closing his notebook at the time. If I could just take a moment to explain the difference between, my life as a police officer and my life as an FBI agent. In the police world, I probably would have handcuffed him right then and arrested him. But in the FBI world, we're much more methodical, and we would then usually schedule an appearance for me to go to a grand jury back in Illinois, testify to this information we're talking about now, request the grand jury issue an indictment, and then we would arrest him. Now, we can do it a different way. We can get a complaint where I just kind of write the facts up in an affidavit and take it to a federal magistrate. But the preferred way is to get an indictment where, a group of citizens listen to the allegations and agree that you have probable cause for an arrest. So that's what we were going to do. I had much more to do with putting this all together for the assistant U.S. attorney back in Illinois to make sure we had every T crossed and I dotted. And as we began to leave, I gave him a business card and I said, if anything happens that you want to share with me or any more information comes to mind, please call me. And as we got to the door, he grabbed my arm and he said, hey, I want to thank you. And I said, for what? And he said, for not doing anything about her being so young. And I just kind of looked at him and said, well, I appreciate you cooperating with me and call me if anything else comes up. And we got outside and I kind of knew right at that point, as did the other agent, that we really now had probably everything we would need to charge him, even though this took almost 2 years between when this had started and me getting to that point of collecting all this data and getting to him and asking him these questions and getting these admissions. The story could almost end there with, me returning to Illinois and going in front of the grand jury and indicting him. But when I returned to Illinois, I felt really good about this case. It wasn't the biggest case I had worked, but I knew it had far-reaching implications. And as I'm preparing to go to the grand jury, which was, still 2 or 3 weeks away, I got a call from a Hennepin County deputy sheriff in Minnesota. And he had heard my name and that I had been looking into Gary. And he asked if that was true. And I said, yes, it was. And he said, I just got a call, just started an investigation where there were 2 young kids, a brother and sister, in that trailer court that were missing for a few hours one evening. And then they came home late and the father was very upset and asked where they had been. And they said, well, we were at Mr. Gary's house playing a game where we took our clothes off. So the father, as you might imagine, was enraged and he was so upset first with the kids for going into a trailer and taking their clothes off. But because he was angry, the kids really thought they had done something wrong and they kind of clammed up and they didn't want to talk about it anymore. So once the detective was called and got involved, he said the kids just were so scared to talk about anything that they really wouldn't tell him the story. And he said, Steve, I'm confident more happened with Gary. And if you have anything that you can charge him with, will you please do it now? So that changed my course. And I immediately called the assistant U.S. attorney. We got in that afternoon to see the magistrate. I had written up an affidavit that kind of summarized in writing everything that we're talking about here. And I was able to get the magistrate to agree to issue a warrant for Gary's arrest for transporting a minor across state lines for purposes of engaging in sex. And much to my field office's credit, they said, Steve, you can fly back tomorrow and actually put your handcuffs on him. But at that point, Jerry, I was really not interested in doing that. I just called the agent that I had met and I said, you were so helpful. Would you finish this by going and arresting him? And the Minneapolis field office arrested him the next day, seized his computer, and of course found some child pornography on his computer as well. And then he was brought back to Illinois a few days later for his initial appearance in front of the same magistrate who issued the warrant. And I learned that was only the second time he'd been to Illinois in his life. The first time was picking up Jenny, and the second time was sitting in a federal courtroom to answer to the charge. And interesting, as the case progressed, he did plead guilty. And, when you're sentenced, Jerry, you get what's called the right of allocution. So you can stand up in front of the judge and make a statement, maybe in mitigation to explain what you did or why you did it, or it's really just your right to make a statement in open court for the judge to hear. And he did exercise his right of allocution, and he stood up right before sentencing and said, I just want to get help. And that was kind of profound. It seemed from the heart but I knew that there was probably a lot more to his life involving damage to children. And I hoped that he was sincere, and it seemed that he was. But when he said, I just wanted to get help, the judge, of course, ordered him to 121 months of imprisonment. And that's how they sentence people in federal court, to the number of months. So you have to do a quick calculation. It was 10 years and 1 month. And the sentence also involved some mandatory supervised release afterwards, a lot of psychological counseling and treatment for what I think was his penchant for involvement with children and pedophilia. So I was very proud about that case. It really spoke to the beauty of the FBI working together with state and locals and working together with other field offices and bringing in specialists that I mentioned, like the victim witness specialist from my field office, the CART analyst that was able to forensically look at the computer and really work together to have a positive outcome.
The effort that was put forth in this case by all parties, especially you, definitely needs to be commended. I'm wondering today, would more be necessary? When you talked about his confession, would you be asked to, get that recorded? And of course, the question is also, when trying to prove the sexual contact, would people be expecting you to produce DNA? Do you think things have changed?
I think you are absolutely right. Maybe because of television, maybe because of books. The most interesting cases involve, video of the person doing the act, DNA showing that evidence was transferred through human to human contact. And I think it can become an expectation that all cases have that overwhelming evidence. But I think it's really incumbent on prosecutors that present information to juries to explain the nature of investigations and why 3 months after the fact, or even 2 weeks after the fact, there would be no DNA available to be recovered from the victim in this case. And there would be no video or audio recording between the victim and the suspect. And you bring up a great point. If I had recorded that myself, it would have been even more powerful. So there's always things that could have been done better and to make your case more solid. And that's a great example if a recording was available of his confession. And as you know, a lot of states require any confession to a murder, if it's going to be a capital offense, to be recorded as a prerequisite to seeking the death penalty.
Well, I know you've worked so many cases during your career, but this one was the one that you wanted to talk about today. And I take it that's because it was special to you. So talk about that.
It's really important in doing investigations that you don't get too personally attached. You shouldn't want to convict a person. You should want to just assimilate the facts, put them together, and sometimes you exonerate a person. Sometimes your case doesn't go in the direction that you think it's going to go, or sometimes you still have a strong thought that the person or persons that you're investigating committed the crimes, but you just can't prove it. So that's why you shouldn't be personally connected. And I think Director Ray says that all the time. Just follow the evidence, follow the rules that we have in place for ourselves, but don't hope for an outcome. Just do the process, and everybody's going to be upset with some part of it. If you arrest somebody, the person who's arrested feels that they've been railroaded. The family of the person feels they've been treated unfairly sometimes. If you don't, the victim becomes maybe upset with the fact that you weren't able to prove the case. There's always somebody who can think that you didn't do enough, or that you maybe took a personal vendetta or an attack against somebody because of a personal feeling. So that's one reason why you don't get personally involved with cases. But this one, I think, did have a profound effect on me, because I realized that this person had probably been doing this for a while and would do it again if he wasn't stopped.
Well, I want to thank you for talking to us about this today. Hopefully, there are people listening, either armchair detectives who have been able to work in solving, some unsolved crimes out there. And of course, anybody in law enforcement that might be able to take some tips from you as you work this investigation, especially when it came to speaking with him and not being judgmental in your tone. I think that probably is one of the best things that you get out of how successful you were in getting your confession from him. So this will be one that people can look at and learn from.
I agree, Jerry. That's so important in law enforcement, not to prejudge people and to just treat everybody with respect. You get so much further in this job by doing that.
Which is hard for people to sometimes understand when it comes to speaking with and interviewing someone that has harmed a child.
Exactly.
Well, we've come to the point of the interview here where we get to learn a little bit more about you. And I know that you mentioned that you became the coordinator of the task force at the RA, and you'd only been in the Bureau for 5 years, which made me leap to the fact or realize that you must have been a police officer before you joined the FBI. So my standard question, when and why did you join the FBI?
So I had been a police officer for about 10 years. I had made sergeant, was very happy in that career. I got to see a lot of things. Things were going well. But I saw two of my colleagues on the police department go to the FBI within 2 years. And I kept in touch with them. One went to the Phoenix division to a small resident agency, which only had 2 or 3 people assigned to it. The other one went to the New York field office where he worked in the most populated division of the FBI. They both really liked it and were exposed to diverse things. So I kind of snuck out and learned about the FBI and took the test without telling anybody, because I certainly didn't want anybody to know that I didn't get hired if they did get hired. And it must have been a year they were just hiring a lot of people, because I did get the opportunity to transition from my police department to the FBI. It was a great move, and I can truthfully say I loved both jobs. I think I was a better FBI agent because of my background in law enforcement.
So did you spend all of your career in the Springfield division?
I spent about 10 years in the Springfield field office and then did a temporary duty assignment for 60 days at FBI headquarters, got exposed to Washington, D.C., and decided to put in for a promotion to supervisory special agent in D.C. So I transitioned to the counterterrorism division, where I was a supervisor, and then later became a unit chief of the terrorist screening operations unit at the terrorist screening center, and then finished my career overseeing the violence reduction unit, which is a unit that encompasses the active shooter response program, which I was very proud to be affiliated with.
Oh, that probably a whole nother episode there. So when did you retire and what are you doing now?
So I retired at the end of 2020. Since then, I've worked for a couple private companies supporting the insider threat mission, developing procedures and policies for other government agencies. And of course, insider threat involves everything from sabotage and espionage to workplace violence and active shooters inside workplaces, suicide and things like that. And I've started at my own company called Lincoln 41, which was my call sign many years ago when I was a police officer, that does private investigations and law enforcement training and consulting. And also I became a member of what's called the Bureau Consortium, which is a really interesting group of people with subject matter expertise in active shooter response. It was formed by an agent out of New York named Jin Kim and Kate Schweit, who I think was also interviewed by you in a previous episode. And they have put together a group of people highly interested in mass attacks and active shooter response to do things like offer policy training, risk assessments, after action reports, and things like that to this terrible dilemma of how we try to stop this active shooter situation. And then in the spring of 2024, I'll start teaching a course at George Mason University in their criminal justice program.
Well, that's fantastic that you're not letting all of those skills and experiences that you gained in the FBI go to waste. I will put links in the show notes to your company and the organization that you are working with, Kate and Jen. I like to give my guest the last word. So, what would you like to say?
So, Jerry, I think I'd like to give a shout out to you. And I have listened to many of your podcasts, and it really does exactly what you say you want to do. It debunks myths and it exposes people to what the FBI does. And even if you were an agent like I was and like you were for over 20 years, you learn so much by listening to other stories and about how the FBI works. You know, people in the FBI have such a diverse pathway that they can seek to go down. If you want to be a polygraph examiner or a firearms instructor or a media rep or an applicant coordinator, or what I was, a special agent assessor, where I went around interviewing new agents to determine if they would be hired by the FBI. What your podcast does, and a lot of your writings, it exposes people to the diversity of the FBI. It's really a great thing. There's no shortage in people applying to be in the Bureau. I think we would both admit we're lucky that we were selected and we were exposed to so many different things. So really a shout out to you, Jerry, for exposing people to the diversity and the strength of the FBI.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of Steve Bennett, links to court documents related to this missing teen online predator investigation, as well as links to FBI retired case file review episodes about how to protect our kids when they're online. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.